The contact appeared on the scope at 3:14, and Ensign Mara Voss knew immediately that the numbers were wrong. She had been running routine sensor calibration on the bridge of the TFS Harrogate, the flagship of 7th Fleet's forward patrol element, when the passive array returned a mass reading that belonged to nothing in the region. No stellar body, no debris field, no commercial convoy. The reading pulsed once, resolved into discrete signatures and multiplied. 14 contacts, then 26, then 91. "Admiral on deck," someone called, but Voss didn't turn. She was watching the cluster of unknown signatures slide across Sector 1140 at a velocity that made her reach for the calibration tool. She ran it twice. The numbers held. Admiral Renaud Castor crossed the bridge in 4 strides and stood at her shoulder. Tall, lean, gray at the temples, cropped to regulation. He smelled like recycled air and black coffee, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular flatness of a man who knew that surprises at 3:14 were never good ones. "Talk to me, Ensign." 91 contacts, sir, unidentified. No transponder, no registry match, no emission profile in any database I can access. Voss kept her voice level, moving through Sector 1140 at .72 light, bearing 115 relative. Castor studied the scope, .72 light. "Yes, sir, and those contacts are massing between 800,000 and 2 million tons each." Something crossed his face, not fear. Recognition that the universe had introduced a variable that didn't belong in any equation he'd been trained to solve. "Get me Commander Rowe." Voss opened the channel. Commander Rowe was the fleet's intelligence officer, a compact woman with dark eyes who had spent 12 years cataloging every known species ship classification in the Orion Spur. She arrived on the bridge 4 minutes later, still pulling on her jacket, and spent exactly 90 seconds reviewing the data before she said the words that changed everything. "There's no match. Not in the compact registry, not in the neutral lanes database, not in any archive I have clearance to access." She looked at Castor. "These contacts don't exist." "They're on my scope," Voss said. "I'm not arguing with your scope, Ensign. I'm telling you that whatever is moving through 1140 has never been scanned, cataloged, or encountered by any member species of the Orion Compact in the 217 years since the Compact was founded. No emission signature match, no hull geometry match, no drive plume spectrography match." Rowe's jaw was tight. "Nothing." Castor absorbed this. He turned to communications. "Flash traffic to 7th Fleet Command, raw sensor data, classification, unknown contact, presumed non-compact, request guidance." Then to Voss, "Course projection, where are they headed?" She ran the calculation and felt her stomach drop. "Sector 1141, in approximately 6 minutes at current velocity, sir. Then 1142 3 minutes after that. If they maintain heading Sector 1149, the Vacherie home system." The bridge went still. The Vacherie were the Compact's 3rd largest member species, silicon-based. 9 centuries of starship construction before humanity discovered fire. Their home system held 11 billion civilians, 3 orbital habitats the size of small moons, a shipyard complex producing a quarter of the Compact's merchant tonnage, and a defense fleet of 400 warships that had never fired a shot in anger because no one had ever been foolish enough to test them. Each one carried plasma batteries capable of slagging asteroids at 3 light seconds, kinetic accelerators launching tungsten rods at a fraction of light speed, and fusion torpedoes that detonated with the force of a small star. 400 of those warships, the most powerful single military concentration in the Compact. "Time to the Vacherie system at current acceleration?" Castor asked. 9 minutes, sir, maybe less. They're still accelerating." 9 minutes, 40 sectors, a distance that would take the Harrogate, running at maximum military power, the better part of 2 days to cover. and the unknowns were crossing it in 9 minutes. Castor stood very still for a long moment. Then he turned to his tactical officer. "Bring the fleet to general quarters. All ships, condition 1, weapons free on my authority." The klaxon sounded across 9 warships simultaneously. 7th Fleet's forward patrol element was not a battle force. It was a tripwire, the heavy cruiser Harrogate. 3 destroyers Kinsale, Brant, and Oleander. 4 frigates Callaway, Shen, Darrows, and Pike. And the fleet tender Hallcroft, which carried fuel, spare parts, and exactly 0 weapons. 9 ships, 7,200 crew between them, against whatever was crossing 40 sectors in 9 minutes. Voss was 23 years old. She had graduated from the Terran Fleet Academy 11 months ago, finished in the upper third of her class, and been assigned to Admiral Castor's staff as a junior sensor officer because her aptitude scores in pattern recognition had been the highest in her cohort. She had never seen combat. In fleet parlance, she was an aide. She ran sensor feeds, organized briefing packets, and made sure the Admiral's coffee was hot. She was not a warrior. She was a clerk with a uniform and a talent for reading scopes. But she could read a scope. And right now her scope was telling her that the universe had just gotten larger and colder and far less predictable than anyone in the Orion Compact had imagined. "Sir," Rowe said quietly, "the emission profile on those contacts just shifted." Voss saw it at the same moment. The unknown fleet's energy output had spiked not gradually, the way a reactor climbed when diverting power to drives, but instantaneously, as if someone had thrown a switch. The spike was so enormous that the passive sensors briefly saturated, their detection curves flatlining before the software compensated. "They're not just moving fast," Rowe said. "They're phase shifting. Look at the spectrography. That's not a conventional drive plume. That's a spatial displacement wave. They're folding local spacetime around their hulls." Phase shifting. The unknowns weren't traveling through normal space in the way the Compact understood it. They were folding it, riding the crest of a displacement wave that carried them forward at velocities that conventional physics said were impossible for anything with mass. The Terran fleet had theoretical models for displacement drives. They were filed under impractical energy requirements exceed total stellar output of Sol. No one had ever built one. No one had seriously considered it possible. "Contact count updating," Voss reported, her voice tight. 114. 23 new contacts in the last 90 seconds. "They're arriving," Rowe said. "More of them from somewhere we can't see." "Or from somewhen," the navigation officer muttered. Nobody laughed. Castor turned to his flag captain. "Captain Acaffer, set an intercept course, best speed." Acaffer, 20 years of command decisions, braided hair, the calm, heavy-lidded look of someone who had long ago made peace with the weight of authority, studied the Admiral for a long moment. "Sir, at our best speed, we won't reach the Vacherie system for 41 hours. Those contacts will be there in 7 minutes. We can't intercept." "I'm aware. Set the course, and get me Compact Fleet Command on the priority channel. I want every warship within 3 days travel vector moving toward the Vacherie system. Everything. Patrol elements, reserve squadrons, training detachments, everything that carries a gun. Compact protocol requires council authorization for a multi-fleet mobilization. Article 17. Unknown threat to a member species home system. Authorization is automatic. Send it." 1 second of hesitation. "Aye, Admiral." Voss watched the scope while the orders went out. The unknown fleet had reached sector 1145. They were decelerating not gradually, but in sharp, impossible steps, shedding velocity in discrete jumps that suggested navigational precision beyond anything she had studied. Each deceleration step was followed by a brief phase shift pulse that Rowe was cataloging at the intelligence station, her fingers a blur. "They're scanning," Rowe said suddenly. "The lead contacts are emitting a broad-spectrum sensor sweep. Frequency range covers every band we use. military, civilian, navigational communications, all of them simultaneously. They're surveying the entire sector as they move through it. Stellar cartography, planetary composition, asteroid mapping, gravitational constants, magnetic field strengths. They're building a map of everything. The flash traffic from 7th Fleet Command came back 12 minutes after Castor sent it. 7th Fleet Command acknowledges. Article 17 confirmed. All available units redirecting. Estimated consolidation, 47 HOURS. Compact Council NOTIFIED. Designating unknowns AS Contact Group Sigma. Advise observation only. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Castor read it, set his jaw, said nothing. 47 hours. Contact Group Sigma would reach the Vashery system in under 5 minutes. The Compact's consolidated response wouldn't arrive for 2 days. Sir, Voss said, Sigma contacts have entered Sector 1149, decelerating to sublight velocities inside the Vashery system. The bridge crew watched in silence as the unknown fleet resolved on the long-range scope. The Vashery Defense Fleet, all 400 warships, the largest single concentration of military force in the Compact, was scrambling. Blue icons spread out from the orbital habitats in a textbook defensive screen, kinetic kill corridors, overlapping plasma fields, torpedo lanes designed for concentrated salvos against shielded targets. None of it was designed for something that could fold space. The first engagement lasted 11 seconds. Contact Group Sigma didn't fire weapons in any way the sensors understood. No energy discharge, no projectile launch, no missile track. The phase shift emissions from the Sigma fleet spiked to a level that temporarily blinded the passive array, and when the sensors recovered 3 seconds later, 43 Vashery warships had vanished. Not destroyed, not debris, vanished. Their signatures gone from the scope as if they had never existed. Phase displacement, Rose said, white-faced. They folded the space around those ships. The Vashery vessels were relocated. I'm picking up their signatures now scattered across 3 adjacent sectors, tumbling drives offline. Moved, instantaneously, like picking up chess pieces and setting them down somewhere else. They moved 43 warships without destroying them. Hull integrity intact, crews alive. Drives will need manual restart but no structural damage. Not an act of war, an act of rearrangement. The unknowns had decided 43 warships were in the wrong place and moved them somewhere else. The difference between rearrangement and violence was the most terrifying thing Voss had ever contemplated. The Vashery Defense Fleet regrouped and fired. Everything they had. Plasma batteries in sustained discharge mode, kinetic accelerators cycling at maximum rate, fusion torpedoes in staggered salvos of 50, point defense clusters repurposed into anti-ship mode. The scope bloomed with energy signatures as hundreds of weapons platforms emptied their magazines in a coordinated barrage that should have turned the Sigma fleet into expanding plasma. Every shot missed. Not deflected, not absorbed, missed. The Sigma contacts phase shifted as the weapon's fire approached, displacing themselves by fractions of a kilometer in intervals too brief for targeting computers to track. The Vashery fire passed through the spaces where the Sigma ships had been microseconds before and continued into nothing. 2 fusion torpedoes, deprived of targets, detonated against each other in sympathetic explosions that damaged a Vashery frigate's sensor array. Friendly fire from their own weapons, bouncing off nothing. They're not even shielded, Rowe whispered. They don't need shields, they're just not there when the fire arrives. The second displacement event removed 112 more Vashery warships from the engagement zone. Relocated to empty space 11 light minutes away, drives offline, crews alive, drifting in the dark. 112 warships, each carrying enough firepower to reduce a continent to glass, picked up and set down like misplaced objects on a desk. The remaining 200, and 45 Vashery ships held their ground for another 8 seconds. 8 seconds of plasma fire, kinetic rounds and fusion, torpedoes pouring into space where the Sigma fleet wasn't. Then their commander ordered a general retreat. The defense fleet broke formation and ran for the system's edge, scattering across 5 different exit vectors, their formations dissolving into a panicked rout. Contact Group Sigma let them go. Total engagement under 30 seconds. 400 warships, the most powerful single military force in the compact, rendered completely irrelevant. No shot landed, no ship destroyed. The Sigma fleet had not killed anyone. That was more terrifying than a massacre. A massacre had motives, territory, resources, ideology, cruelty. This was a force so overwhelmingly beyond conventional military capability that killing was beneath its notice. It decided where things were allowed to be, and anything that disagreed was relocated until it stopped disagreeing. Castor was on the priority channel for the next 3 hours, speaking to Compact Fleet Command, the Council, the Vashery government in exile forming aboard the scattered remnants of the defense fleet. Voss listened to fragments while maintaining her sensor watch, tracking the Sigma fleet as it settled into stable orbit around the Vashery homeworld. They weren't bombarding, they weren't landing troops, they weren't broadcasting demands or ultimatums. They were orbiting, scanning, cataloging, building their map with the same methodical, unhurried precision they had shown while crossing 40 sectors. They're cataloging atmospheric composition down to trace elements, Rowe reported during the second hour. Mineral densities of every body in the system, gravitational variance across the orbital plane, population distribution on the homeworld mapped by density cluster. They know where every city is, every factory, every power plant, every agricultural zone, every water treatment facility. What are they doing with it? Storing it, transmitting it somewhere we can't detect, probably through the same phase shift mechanism they use for travel, sending it home, wherever home is. Rowe hesitated. Admiral, I ran a projection based on their survey rate and their vector before they entered the Vashery system. If they continue along their established heading after completing this survey, the next system in their path is relevant. The name hit the bridge like a physical blow. Relevant. Human colony. 47 million civilians. 2 orbital stations. A small garrison fleet of 12 frigates that couldn't have slowed the Sigma fleet for a single heartbeat. Time to survey completion in the Vashery system, Castor asked. At their current rate, 12 to 14 hours. Time for us to reach relevant at maximum military power. 14 hours, sir. The numbers were brutally simple. Leave now, burn the drives to the red line, and they could reach relevant at roughly the same time. The Sigma fleet finished its Vashery survey and moved on. They would arrive exhausted, with overheated drives and depleted fuel reserves, to face a force that could fold space itself. Sir, Voss said, because someone had to say it, our orders are to observe, not engage. Castor looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed from hours of tension, but the intelligence behind them was undiminished. Ensign, there are 47 million people on relevant, 12 frigates in the garrison. If that fleet arrives and the garrison does what the Vashery did, fires on them, they'll be displaced, scattered, and then the Sigma fleet will survey our people the way you'd survey an anthill. Without asking, without caring, without noticing. Yes, sir. Set course for relevant, all ships, maximum military power. The transit was 14 hours of grinding tension that wore through composure and left nerves raw. Voss maintained continuous sensor contact with the Sigma fleet throughout, watching their survey progress like a countdown timer she couldn't stop. At hour 4, the contact count rose to 137 more arrivals, materializing from directions the sensors couldn't track. At hour 7, the survey reached the Vashery homeworld's southern hemisphere, and the scan intensity tripled. suggesting something in the geological composition had caught their attention. At hour 9, 2 Sigma contacts broke formation and moved to the system's outer asteroid belt for focused mineral prospecting. At hour 11, a development froze Voss's blood. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice level through discipline, "I'm detecting a second contact group, designating contact group Sigma 2, 44 contacts, identical emission profile. Current position, Sector 1162. Sector 1162 was beyond the Vashari system, beyond relevant, on the far side of the compact's eastern frontier, in a region that contained 3 more member species home systems and the compact's primary deep space communications relay. "They're not one fleet," Rose said, and her voice had gone very quiet. "They're a survey network. Multiple groups operating simultaneously across different sectors." "How many groups?" Castor asked. "I can confirm 2, but their methodology suggests a grid pattern. If that's the case, possibly 6 to 8 groups total, each with 100+ contacts. Not one fleet of 137, possibly 8 fleets, 1,000 contacts or more, spread across the compact's space, surveying everything simultaneously. The compact's entire combined military hadn't slowed the first group for 30 seconds. "It changes nothing," Castor said. His voice was flat and certain. "We go to relevant, we stand between them and our people, that's what we do." The Compact Council convened an emergency session within the hour. Voss could hear fragments of the debate bleeding through the priority channel. Whenever Castor's line crossed with the council feed, the Vashari representative's synthesized voice, flat and cold with silicon precision, demanding immediate military response. The Torani delegate counseling patience. The human ambassador reminding everyone that there was nothing in the Compact's arsenal that could touch the Sigma fleet, and that patience wasn't a strategy. It was the absence of one. The debate was irrelevant. By the time the council agreed on anything, the Sigma fleet would have finished its survey and moved on. Voss understood this with the clarity of someone who dealt in numbers rather than politics. The Sigma fleet operated on timescales that made political deliberation meaningless. They had been doing this for tens of thousands of years. A 12-hour council debate was less than a rounding error in their operational history. What mattered was what happened next, where they went after the Vashari system, and whether anyone would be standing in the doorway when they arrived. During the 6th hour of the Vashari survey, Roe made a discovery that deepened the dread. She had been analyzing the Sigma fleet's scanning patterns, the frequencies they used, the resolution of their instruments, the data structures embedded in their transmissions, and she found something that didn't fit the surveyor hypothesis. "They're not just mapping," she told Castor during a brief update session on the bridge, her voice carefully controlled. "They're classifying. Every species they scan, they assign a designation based on a set of behavioral parameters I'm still decoding. But I can read 2 of the parameters clearly: threat response capability and spatial persistence." "Meaning what?" "Threat response capability is straightforward. It's a measure of military power. How much force a species can project, how quickly, how effectively. The Vashari rate very high on that parameter. Their 400 warships, their weapons capability, their defensive infrastructure, all of it factors in." "And spatial persistence?" Roe hesitated. "That's the one I'm struggling with. It appears to measure how long a species maintains its position when displaced, how quickly it returns to contested space, how many times it attempts to re-engage after being removed." She looked at Castor. "In every species they've cataloged, the spatial persistence value is effectively 0. 1 displacement and the species yields. The parameter exists in their classification system, but it's never been non-zero." The implication hung in the air. The Sigma fleet had a parameter for measuring stubbornness. They had built it into their classification system. They had been tracking it across 23 species and tens of thousands of years. And it had never been triggered. "That parameter is going to matter," Castor said quietly. "Yes, sir," Rowe agreed. "I believe it is." During the 8th hour, Voss noticed something else. The Sigma Fleet's survey of the Vashery system was proceeding at a pace she could now predict with reasonable accuracy. She had been tracking their scan rates, their dwell times on individual targets, their transition patterns between survey objects. The prediction told her something useful. They were thorough, but they were also systematic. They worked in a grid. They didn't skip ahead. They didn't prioritize. Which meant their arrival at relevant was predictable. Not just approximately, but precisely. She could calculate the minute they would finish the Vashery survey and the minute they would begin decelerating into the relevant approach corridor, with an error margin of less than 15 minutes. She ran the calculation 4 times, cross-checked it against Rowe's survey rate analysis, and presented it to Castor. "They'll finish the Vashery survey at approximately 3:41 tomorrow, sir. They'll reach the relevant approach corridor at approximately 3:47. Our transit time at maximum military power is 14 hours and 12 minutes, which means if we depart by 13:35 today, we arrive with a 47-minute margin." Castor looked at the numbers, "And if we're wrong, if they finish early, then we arrive after they do. And 47 million people on Relevant have 12 frigates between them and a fleet that can fold space. We depart at 13:30, 5 minutes early. I'd rather arrive with an hour to spare and overheated drives than 5 minutes late, and a clean conscience." The transit itself was a crucible. Maximum military power meant pushing the drives to their rated maximum and holding them there for 14 continuous hours, something the engineering manuals described as permitted for intervals not exceeding 4 hours, and likely to result in accelerated component degradation. Petrov's running commentary on the state of the Harrogate's primary reactor coupling became a grim countdown that the entire bridge could hear through the open intercom. Hour 2, coupling temperature at 106% of rated max, within tolerance, but the tolerance band is a polite fiction at this point. Hour 5, 112%. I've bypassed 3 safety interlocks. If the Inspector General asks, I was never here. Hour 8, 118%. The coupling is making a sound I've never heard before. It's either harmonic resonance or the metal praying. Hour 11, 122. I've run out of interlocks to bypass. We're operating on what I would charitably describe as hope. The other ships were faring no better. The Kinsale reported her number 2 reactor running rough, with intermittent power fluctuations that made her lighting flicker, and her weapons targeting systems drift by fractions of a degree. The Brandt's thruster malfunction, present since the pre-deployment maintenance cycle, never serious enough to warrant a return to dock, was now severe enough that her attitude control responded with a noticeable delay, like a drunk trying to walk a straight line. The Oleander's port sensor array, already fragile from 3 years of deferred maintenance, was showing stress fractures in its mounting brackets that would likely fail under any significant lateral force. 9 ships running at maximum power for 14 hours across empty space, racing to arrive before something that could cross the same distance in minutes. The mathematics were absurd. The effort was absurd. The entire enterprise was absurd. But 47 million people lived on Relevant. An absurdity was a luxury that could be addressed after they were safe. They arrived with 47 minutes to spare. The 9 ships dropped out of maximum burn with drives at thermal redline, engineering crews fighting temperature warnings across every major system. Lieutenant Commander Petrov, the Harrogate's chief engineer, reported the primary reactor coupling running 14 degrees above rated maximum. "I can hold it for another 10 hours, maybe 12. After that, I'm shutting down whether you like it or not, Admiral." The 9 ships arranged themselves in a picket formation across the Relevant approach corridor, the vector the Sigma fleet would have to use if it followed its established heading. A thin line of hulls and guns and stubbornness strung across the dark. Voss had not slept in 26 hours. She had spent the transit studying the Sigma fleet's phase displacement patterns frame by frame, looking for anything a weakness, a lag, a limitation, a gap in the impossible precision of their spatial folding. She found one thing. "Sir," she told Castor 30 minutes before the Sigma fleet was projected to arrive, "there's a recovery interval. After each phase displacement event, the Sigma contact's energy output drops to baseline for between 2 and 4 seconds before they can displace again. It's consistent across every event in the Vashery engagement data. 19 events, and every single one shows the same 2 to 4 second gap." 2 to 4 seconds, Castor repeated. "Yes, sir. During that interval, they're physically present in normal space. Fixed. They can't displace us during those seconds. But we'd have to trigger a displacement first to create the window." "Exactly, sir. We have to be displaced first. Then we have 2 to 4 seconds where they can't do it again." Castor studied her. "You're suggesting we let them throw us, then sprint back to position during their recovery window?" "Repeatedly, sir. Every time they spend energy relocating us, they need those seconds to recover. If we can cycle fast enough reposition and re-engage within that window, we can maintain a persistent presence in the engagement zone. We can't stop them. We can't hurt them, but we can make them deal with us continuously instead of surveying. Every displacement costs them energy and time. Enough of them, and we slow their entire operation down." "You want to be a nuisance." "I want to be an obstacle, sir. A persistent, recurring, mathematically inexhaustible obstacle." Castor looked at her for a long time. The red-rimmed eyes, the gray hair, the flat, certain expression of a man who had spent 30 years learning that the only thing you could control was whether you showed up. "Draw up a tactical plan. Present it to the flagstaff in 20 minutes. Voss's plan was simple because it had to be. Complexity required capabilities they didn't have. 9 ships, standard drives, standard weapons that couldn't touch the Sigma fleet anyway. One advantage, the recovery interval. The ships would hold a rotating picket across the approach corridor. When displaced, each ship would immediately fire emergency thrusters to arrest tumble, reorient on the corridor bearing, and sprint back to position at maximum burn. Drive restart sequences would be preloaded for instant execution. Engineering teams would maintain hot standby protocols, keeping drives one command away from full power. The goal was not to damage the Sigma fleet. The goal was to force continuous displacement events, draining energy and attention from the survey operation. Like standing in a doorway and refusing to move. You get pushed aside. You stand back up. You get pushed again. You stand back up again. Captain Akefer called it exactly that. The tactical equivalent of standing in a doorway and refusing to move. Petrov called it suicide by stubbornness. Then he began optimizing his drive restart sequence, cutting it from the standard 90-second protocol down to something he estimated could run in under 3 seconds. "Fast and dangerous, or slow and safe?" he asked over the intercom. "Fast," Castor said. "If the coupling blows, we lose the primary drive permanently." "Understood." The Sigma fleet finished its Vashery survey 12 hours and 41 minutes after entering the system. 137 contacts oriented toward relevant and began accelerating. Voss watched them come. The displacement wave built ahead of the fleet like a bow wave on a ship at sea, bending local spacetime into patterns the sensors struggled to render. The contacts crossed sector 1149 in 4 minutes, 1150 in 3, and decelerated into the relevant approach corridor at 2:17 local time, 26 hours after initial detection. They found 9 human warships waiting. The Harrogate sat at the center of the picket formation, flanked by the destroyers Kinsale, Brant, and Oleander, with the 4 frigates at the cardinal points and the tender Hallcroft hanging back at maximum sensor range. A gossamer thread stretched across the path of something that could fold reality itself. The Sigma fleet decelerated to sublight and stopped. For the first time since initial contact, the unknown stopped moving. 137 contacts, motionless in space, phase displacement drives at idle, survey sensors focused on the 9 warships blocking their path. 47 seconds of silence, the longest pause in the Sigma fleet's observable behavior. "They're scanning us," Rose said. "Let them," Castor replied. Then the displacement wave began to build. "Phase shift spike on lead Sigma contacts," Voss reported. "They're preparing to displace us. All ships, brace for displacement. Execute recovery protocol on my mark." The waves hit the Harrogate like a wall of nothing. One moment Voss was at her console on the bridge. The next, the stars outside the viewports had changed. The navigational display showed a position 7,000 kilometers from where they'd been, and every system on the ship was screaming proximity warnings as the Harrogate tumbled through space with her drives offline. Emergency thrusters fired. The ship stabilized. Voss grabbed her console and hauled herself upright against the residual spin, her teeth rattling from the sudden deceleration. "Displacement complete," she reported, keeping her voice steady through force of will. 7,000 clicks from original position. Drives offline. Restarting now. Petrov's modified sequence fired. The drives caught in 2.7 seconds, nearly 30 times faster than standard protocol. "Drives up, repositioning." The heavy cruiser swung back toward the approach corridor at emergency power and slid into position directly in the Sigma fleet's path. Kinsale was already there. She'd recovered in 2.1 seconds, the fastest in the formation. Brant was closing with a thruster stutter on her port quarter. The frigates were scattered wider but converging from 4 different vectors. 41 seconds after being thrown 7,000 kilometers, all 9 ships were back in the corridor. The Sigma fleet displaced them again. 12,000 kilometers this time. The Harrogate's hull groaned as the spatial folding released, and 2 crew members in the engineering section were thrown into bulkheads hard enough for the medics. Petrov's voice came over the intercom, strained but controlled. "Drive restart in 3.1. That last one torqued the primary coupling. I can hold it, but the tolerance is thinning." They repositioned, 47 seconds back to the corridor. Third displacement, 19,000 kilometers. The Oleander lost her port sensor array to structural stress during the recovery tumble, partially blind on one side. Commander Chen kept her in formation, compensating with the starboard array. They came back. Fourth displacement, 23,000 kilometers. Brant's thruster malfunction worsened, and she corkscrewed during recovery, passing within 80 meters of the Kinsale's hull, close enough that both ships' collision alarms screamed. The Harrogate's secondary reactor loop developed a coolant leak. Voss could smell it on the recycled air, a sharp chemical tang that meant something was bleeding inside the ship's guts. They came back. Fifth displacement. The Sigma fleet changed tactics. Instead of pushing all 9 ships in the same direction, it scattered them, each ship thrown to a different point in a sphere 28,000 kilometers across. Recovery time jumped to 3 minutes and 12 seconds as the formation had to locate each other, reform, and navigate back from 9 different vectors. The Daros nearly collided with the Pike when both ships sprinted for the same re-entry point from converging angles. They came back. Sixth displacement, 31,000 kilometers. The frigate Pike lost her main communications array, forcing her to relay all traffic through the Shen. The tender Hallcroft reported hull microfractures along her spine, stress fractures from the repeated spatial folding that were slowly weakening her structural keel. Seventh displacement. Sigma tried a rapid double pulse, throwing the formation once and then immediately again, before recovery was complete. The second throw caught 4 ships mid-restart and sent them tumbling with drives half engaged, the torque from partial thrust amplifying their spin into violent gyrations. The Darrows cracked her port drive nozzle under the stress, 60% thrust from that point forward. Recovery time, 4 minutes and 47 seconds, the longest yet. They came back. 8th displacement, 35,000 kilometers. The Shen reported a buckled frame on deck 4. The Harrogate's port ventral sensor pod went dark not from the displacement itself, but from the cumulative stress of 7 recoveries wearing through the mounting brackets. Voss lost 30 degrees of coverage on the underside. She compensated with the dorsal array and taped a handwritten note to her console marking the dead zone. They came back. 9th displacement. Sigma applied a rotational component for the first time. Each ship wasn't just moved but spun. The Harrogate came out tumbling on 3 axes simultaneously. Emergency thrusters fired in a stuttering sequence as the attitude control system fought to arrest the compound spin. 2 crew members in the medical bay were thrown from their beds. The water reclamation system ruptured on deck 7, flooding a corridor with recycled water that began freezing in the sections where heating had failed. Petrov's language over the intercom was creative and anatomically specific. Drive restart, 3.8 seconds. The coupling temperature was deep in the red. They came back. 10th displacement. The Callaway's drives wouldn't restart. The frigate drifted dead in space 34,000 kilometers from the corridor. Her engineering team ran the restart sequence 3 times. Nothing. The primary coupling had fractured cleanly, a stress fracture that had been growing since the 3rd displacement, finally splitting under the 10th. Callaway is non-recoverable, Acaffer reported, requesting the tender for retrieval. Send the Hallcroft, Castor said. His voice was flat. No hesitation, no mourning, time for that later. 8 ships now. By the 7th displacement, 5 hours into the engagement, the pattern had become a rhythm that Voss's body knew before her mind processed it. The wave building on the sensors, that particular spike in the phase shift emissions that meant the field was forming. The gut-wrenching lurch of relocation, the instant of nothingness between where you were and where you'd been thrown, like falling through a hole in the universe. The spinning recovery emergency thrusters hammering, the ship groaning as angular momentum fought against corrective thrust. The drive restart, Petrov's modified sequence running in those precious seconds, the coupling catching with a sound like a giant clearing its throat. The sprint back, maximum emergency power, the drive screaming, the hull rattling, every bolt and weld and seal protesting the abuse. And then the reform finding the others on the scope, closing formation, sliding back into the corridor. Her hands were raw from gripping the console through 17 hours of repeated impacts. Her neck ached from the whiplash of recovery tumbles. She had bitten through her lower lip during the 5th displacement and could taste blood every time she swallowed. The bridge smelled like ozone from overstressed electrical systems, burned insulation from cables that had rubbed through their sheathing during the tumbles, and the sour chemical tang of coolant from the leaking secondary reactor loop that Petrov had finally given up trying to seal. None of it mattered. What mattered was the scope, and the corridor, and the 8 blue icons that kept dragging themselves back to the same position like something out of a myth, the boulder that rolls uphill, the door that won't stay shut, the thing that refuses to stop being in the way. On the 11th displacement, Voss noticed something in the Sigma fleet's behavior that she hadn't seen before. The displacement field had been perfectly uniform in all previous events, a smooth, symmetrical spatial folding that relocated everything within its radius with equal force and precision. But this time, the field showed a slight asymmetry, a hesitation in the leading edge, as if the system generating it had briefly considered not activating. She flagged it for Rowe. The intelligence officer studied the data for 90 seconds and then said, very quietly, "They're uncertain." Uncertain about what? about whether to displace us again. The field hesitation corresponds to what I'd interpret in their mathematical framework as a computational pause. They're running a decision tree, and one of the branches is producing an unfamiliar output. Rowe looked at her. They're encountering a species that behaves in a way their decision architecture can't efficiently process. Every displacement costs them energy, not much, individually, but the cumulative expenditure is significant after 11 events. Their operational model predicted that 1 displacement would be sufficient, then 2, then 5. At some point, the model is supposed to converge on a solution. It's not converging. Because we keep coming back. Because you keep coming back. The model can't predict when you'll stop, because you haven't given it any evidence that you ever will. Voss looked at the scope. 8 blue icons in the corridor. 137 amber contacts, motionless. The math was simple. The Sigma fleet could keep displacing them forever. Their energy reserves, whatever they were, clearly dwarfed anything the human ships could muster. They could throw 8 ships across space until every coupling shattered, and every drive failed, and every hull stress indicator went from amber to red to flashing critical. But they weren't doing that. They had paused. They were calculating, and their calculation was producing an unfamiliar output. Because the model assumed that everything, eventually, stopped coming back. And 8 ships hadn't. The 12th displacement confirmed Rowe's analysis. The field hesitated again, a fractional pause, barely measurable but present. And this time, when the ships recovered and sprinted back, the Sigma fleet waited 11 seconds before displacing them for the 13th time. Previously, the intervals between displacements had been shrinking as the Sigma fleet cycled faster, trying to outpace the human recovery protocol. Now the interval was growing. The cycle was slowing. Something was changing in the Sigma fleet's decision architecture, and Voss could track it in the displacement intervals the way a doctor reads a patient's pulse. Fast meant aggressive. Slow meant uncertain. And uncertain, when applied to a species that had been doing the same thing without variation for tens of thousands of years, meant that something unprecedented was happening inside whatever passed for their collective mind. The 13th displacement was the one that cost them the Oleander's last sensor array. The 14th nearly killed the Brand. The 15th took the Harrogate's secondary reactor, but between each event the intervals grew longer, 12 seconds, 15, 21. The Sigma fleet was spending more time calculating between throws and less time throwing. By the 16th displacement, the interval had stretched to 34 seconds, more than enough time for the formation to recover, reform, and settle back into position with something approaching dignity rather than the frantic scramble of the earlier rounds. The Shen's captain used the extra time to seal a hull breach on her lower deck. The Pike's engineering team managed to restore partial communications, small repairs, small mercies. The kind of breathing room that exists only because something immensely powerful has decided, for reasons it has never had to articulate before, to give you a moment to collect yourself before it asks the question it has never had to ask. Voss used the interval to run a final analysis on the displacement data. She compiled every field measurement, every energy reading, every recovery time, every interval duration into a single dataset and looked at the shape of it. The shape was a curve that started steep short intervals, aggressive cycling, the Sigma fleet trying to solve the problem of 8 immovable ships through sheer repetition, and then flattened as the intervals grew longer and the hesitation deepened. The curve was approaching an asymptote. The Sigma fleet was approaching a decision point where the cost of continued displacement exceeded the value of the space being contested. But it wasn't just about energy costs. It was about something deeper. The curve showed a species encountering a concept it didn't have. Not resistance, they understood resistance. The Vacherie had resisted. Resistance was a known quantity. Apply force, resistance breaks, survey continues. What they were encountering now was persistence. resistance that didn't break, resistance that absorbed the force and came back, resistance that treated each displacement not as a defeat, but as a temporary inconvenience, like being asked to step aside and politely declining, and then being pushed aside and walking back, and then being thrown across the room and climbing to your feet and walking back again. The curve said, "We don't know what to do with this." And then the 17th displacement came, and instead of throwing them, the Sigma fleet spoke. 11th displacement, 37,000 kilometers. The Daros, running at 60% thrust from the cracked nozzle, couldn't sprint back fast enough. She arrived 40 seconds after the rest of the formation, gasping into position on fumes. Her captain reported fuel reserves at 11%. One more sprint, maybe two, and she would be running on emergency reserves. 12th displacement, 39,000 kilometers. Voss lost contact with the Pike for 2 minutes and 14 seconds during recovery. The frigate's communication relay had failed entirely, and she was running dark, sprinting back to the corridor on dead reckoning, without confirmation that the corridor was still the right place to sprint to. When she reappeared on the scope, her hull integrity was at 87%, and her captain was speaking in a voice that was very calm and very tired. 13th displacement. The Oleander's remaining sensor array failed completely. She was blind. Navigating by dead reckoning, and whatever sensor feed the Kinsel could relay to her in the seconds between displacements. Commander Chen refused to withdraw. "Point me at the corridor," he said over the fleet channel, and there was something in his voice that was beyond courage and beyond stubbornness, something that lived in the place where a man's identity and his duty became the same thing. "I'll hold position by feel if I have to." 8 ships, one of them blind. 14th displacement, 41,000 kilometers. The Brandt's thruster malfunction cascaded into a secondary failure in her attitude control system. She recovered from the displacement in a slow, ugly spiral that took 90 seconds to arrest. Her captain reported that the next displacement might be the last one she could recover from. The structural integrity of her port hull was compromised, and the attitude thrusters on that side were firing intermittently at best. 15th displacement. The Harrogate's secondary reactor loop failed entirely. Petrov shut it down and rerouted everything to the primary, cutting the ship's power output by 30%. Drive restart time increased from 2.7 seconds to 4.1. Slower, but still within the recovery window. Barely. 16th displacement, 42,000 kilometers, the farthest yet. Recovery time stretched to 5 minutes and 30 seconds as the battered ships struggled to find each other and reform. The Shen's hull integrity dropped below 90%. The Brandt was trailing a visible stream of atmosphere from a cracked ventral seal, a white plume of escaping air crystallizing in the vacuum, marking her position like a wound leaking blood. They came back. 5 hours and 17 minutes now, 16 displacement events, 106 injuries across the formation, the Callaway dead in space, the Oleander blind, the Daros limping at 60%, the Brandt bleeding atmosphere, the Harrogate running on one reactor with a coupling that Petrov described as held together by thermal paste and prayer. And the Sigma fleet had not resumed its survey. 137 contacts sat motionless in space, while 8 human warships battered, bleeding from a dozen wounds, held together by emergency repairs, and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't know when to stop kept dragging themselves back to the same position, over and over, for 5 hours. On the 17th displacement, something changed. Voss felt the wave build differently this time. The sensors showed the displacement field forming, but it was narrower, focused on the Harrogate alone, not the entire formation. And then, instead of the gut-wrenching lurch of relocation, something else happened. A signal. The communications array lit up with a transmission on a frequency the Sigma fleet had never used before. It wasn't in any known language. It wasn't language at all in the conventional sense. It was mathematics, a sequence of prime numbers followed by geometric proofs followed by something that Roe, working furiously at her console, identified as a spatial relationship diagram. "They're communicating," Roe said. "They're trying to talk to us." "What are they saying?" Castor asked. Roe worked for another minute, cross-referencing the mathematical structure against every first contact protocol in the compact database. Then she looked up, and her expression was something Voss had never seen on the intelligence officer's face before. Not fear, not confusion, wonder. "They're asking why we keep coming back." The silence on the bridge was absolute, not a breath, not a shift of weight. Every officer, every technician, every crew member in earshot frozen in the amber of that single sentence. "They've encountered other species," Roe continued, her voice trembling slightly. "The mathematical framework includes reference to 23 other spatial relationship models, 23 other species they've surveyed over the course of their operations. Every previous case followed the same pattern. The local defense forces were displaced once and did not return. They retreated. They yielded the space. The Sigma fleet surveyed the system and moved on." She paused. "They don't have a framework for a species that comes back. We're outside their model. We're something they've never encountered in tens of thousands of years of operation." Castor stood at the center of his battered bridge. The lights were dimmed to conserve power from the single remaining reactor. Half the consoles were running on backup circuits. The viewports showed a star field that had shifted 17 times in 5 hours. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot, his face drawn with fatigue. His hands were steady. "Tell them why," he said. "Sorry." "Build a mathematical response. Tell them this space contains 47 million of our people. Tell them we are not yielding it. Tell them we will continue to reposition ourselves in their path for as long as our ships can fly and our crews can stand." Roe hesitated. "Sir, I'm not certain I can convey the concept of territorial sovereignty in their mathematical framework. They don't appear to have." "Then convey refusal. That's simpler." Roe built the response in 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, the Sigma fleet did not displace anyone. 137 contacts hung motionless in space, scanning the 8 remaining human ships, waiting for an answer. The response went out. A mathematical expression of negation, a spatial relationship diagram showing points returning to the same position after displacement, repeating without terminal condition. An infinite loop, refusal rendered in geometry. The Sigma fleet was silent for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Voss counted every one of them, her eyes locked on the scope, watching for displacement waves. Nothing. The unknowns were thinking, processing, encountering something that tens of thousands of years of survey operations across 23 species had never produced. Then they transmitted again. The message was longer, more complex. Roe translated it in fragments, her voice carrying the strained intensity of someone deciphering scripture in real time. "They're describing their mission. Survey, catalog, map. They've been doing it for." The time reference is difficult, but the number is enormous. Tens of thousands of years, possibly much longer. They describe 23 species they've encountered. In every case, the species yielded. In every case, the Sigma fleet completed its survey and moved on without causing permanent harm. And now they're describing us, the ships that keep coming back. Roe's voice was strange, awed, and shaken at the same time. They've created a new category in their classification system, a mathematical designation I can't translate directly, but the structural reference is closest to unresolved variable, something their model cannot predict or account for. A murmur ran through the bridge crew. Voss felt the hair on her arms rise. 23 species across tens of thousands of years, and none of them had warranted a new category. None of them had been something the model couldn't predict. Another transmission came through, shorter this time, more direct. Rowe decoded it in under a minute. They want to know how many times we'll return if displaced. Castor didn't hesitate, not for a fraction of a second. Every time. Rowe translated the answer into a mathematical expression of recurrence without terminal condition. Infinity stated as simple fact. The response came back in 9 seconds. A single mathematical object, a structure that Rowe stared at for a long time, her fingers motionless on her console, her lips moving as she worked through it. "They've modified their survey protocol," she said finally, and her voice cracked on the last word. "They're requesting permission." The bridge was silent. "They're asking for access to the relevant system for the purpose of non-invasive survey. Duration, estimated 42 hours. No interference with orbital infrastructure, population centers, or military assets. They're offering to share their complete survey data with us upon completion." Rowe looked at Castor, and there were tears on her face. "Admiral, they've never asked permission before. In tens of thousands of years of survey operations across 23 species, they have never encountered a reason to ask." Voss felt something move through the bridge, not a sound, not a word, but a collective shift in the way people were breathing. The weight of what had just happened settling into bone and marrow, and the deep, quiet places where meaning lives. Castor looked at his scope. 137 contacts that could fold space itself. 8 battered human ships with cracked hulls, blown reactors. A blind destroyer holding position on borrowed sensor feed. A frigate bleeding atmosphere from a cracked seal. And a flagship running on one reactor held together by thermal paste. "Granted," he said, "on the condition that our ships maintain a monitoring presence throughout the survey. We stay in the system. We watch." Rowe transmitted the terms. The response was immediate, agreement expressed as a mathematical identity, an equation with both sides balanced. The Sigma fleet entered the relevant system at sublight speed, in a formation that left a corridor open for the human ships to maintain their position. They had never done that before. In 23 previous encounters across tens of thousands of years, they had simply moved through whatever was in their way. Now they went around. The Consolidated Response Force arrived 21 hours later. 642 warships from 11 compact species, weapons charged, formations tight, ready for a battle that had already been decided by 8 ships and a word. Admiral Thren of the Vashery hailed the Harrogate and requested a situation briefing. Castor gave it in 6 sentences. The channel was silent for a long time after he finished. "You stood in front of them," Thren said, "with 9 ships. 8 by the end," Castor corrected. "The Callaway lost her drives on the 10th displacement." 8 ships. Against a force that scattered my 400 in 30 seconds. Another long silence. "And they asked your permission." "Yes." "In 10,000 years of surveying, they never asked anyone's permission." "So they tell us." Thren was quiet for a very long time. When he spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been reverence or disbelief, or the place where those two things meet. "What did you tell them, Admiral, when they asked how many times you'd come back?" "I told them the truth," Castor said. "Every time." The Sigma Fleet's catalog entry for humanity, compiled over the following weeks as Rowe's team built a proper translation framework with a growing staff of compact mathematicians and linguists, contained no reference to weapons capability, fleet tonnage, or territorial extent. Those metrics were, to a species that could fold space, meaningless. The entry contained a single mathematical expression, infinite recurrence without terminal condition. A variable that returns to the same position no matter how many times it is displaced. An equation that cannot be resolved because it has no solution. In the oldest survey archive in the galaxy, stretching back tens of thousands of years and encompassing 23 species and uncounted systems, it was the only entry of its kind. The Sigma fleet completed its relevant survey in 39 hours. When it finished, it transmitted its data terabytes of cartographic, atmospheric, geological, and gravitational analysis to the human ships first. Not to the compact fleet, not to the council, to the 8 battered ships that had stood in the doorway. Then it oriented toward the next system on its path and sent one final transmission. Rowe decoded it in under a minute. Request for survey access. Next system. Duration, estimated 51 hours, terms as previously agreed. They were asking again. Castor looked at Voss. She looked back at him. The bridge was quiet, the good quiet, the kind that comes after something has been settled, and the settling was worth the cost. Tell them granted, the Admiral said. Same conditions, we watch. The Sigma fleet accelerated out of the relevant system. 8 human warships followed drives running hot, hull fractures sealed with emergency compound, the Oleander navigating by borrowed sensor feed from the Kinsale, because her own arrays were scrap. The Brant trailing a faint wisp of crystallized atmosphere from a seal that had been patched but would never truly be fixed. The Darrows running at 60% thrust and hoping her remaining drive nozzle held. Behind them, the consolidated fleet began to break into patrol formations along the Sigma fleet's projected path. 642 warships spreading out like a net, ready to hold other corridors, other systems, other doorways. Because the Sigma fleet would keep surveying, system by system, sector by sector, and at every system, at every corridor, in every doorway, someone would need to stand and say the word. Voss opened a new file on her console. Tracking log, entry 2. The unknown fleet had crossed 40 sectors in 9 minutes. It had displaced 400 warships without firing a shot. It had surveyed 23 species across millennia without ever being delayed, without ever being questioned, without ever being refused. And then 8 ships battered, exhausted, held together by emergency welds and the flat certainty of a gray-haired admiral who ran on black coffee, and the knowledge that 47 million people were behind him, had taught it something it had never learned in all those millennia of operation. That some things don't move, not because they can't be moved, not because they're too strong to be moved, but because moving is not something they will do. The force applied is irrelevant. The odds are irrelevant. The mathematics of displacement and power and capability are irrelevant, because the answer to how many times will you come back has no upper bound, and a species that cannot be permanently relocated cannot be permanently dismissed. Tracking log, entry 1. The unknown fleet crossed 40 sectors in 9 minutes. The distance between that entry and the one where they asked permission was 8 ships, 17 displacements, and a single word that had never appeared in the oldest archive in the galaxy. No,